watching the stars through the enormous window of the Defense Command Center. Commander Jen Park's hands were clasped behind her back, yet the most recent news caused her fingers to twitch. 3 more colonies destroyed, millions dead. The gap weighed heavily on her thoughts. As the swarm approached Commander, a quiet voice interrupted her reverie. When the council was prepared, Jaiwan went to her assistant and thanked her for straightening. Every step she took in her silver outfit as she made her way to the council room reverberated in the Hainal capital city was once a bustling metropolis, but today the majority of individuals remained in the subterranean bunkers, and 5 faces turned to gaze at her as the council room doors silently slid open. Counselor Hurley, who was the only one of the original 12 council members left, sat in the middle and maintained her customary calm demeanor. Commander Park Heron murmured, "Please share," as black circles appeared under her eyes. Jaiwan tapped her data pad in your report, and a hologram filled the room with red dots. Shown how our defenses are failing in the areas where the Void Swarm has destroyed their hives. The swarm adjusts too. She hesitated at the present pace at which they are learning our patterns, outpacing our ability to produce new weapons. We'll arrive at our home world in 3 months. The room was silent for a while. The Hainal had long taken pride in their sophisticated technology, which allowed their ships to move across stars in days. Cities were floating in the skies, and their computers could solve issues that others would take years to solve in a matter of seconds. "What do you recommend?" Heron asked. None of it was sufficient to defeat the Void Swarm. Jaiwan inhaled deeply and said, "I want to turn on the beacon." The chamber burst into, "We don't even know what the old beacon is, but it's too hazardous." Heron raised her hand, and then there was quiet. "Does this mean we can't trust extraterrestrial technology?" "We don't know, Commander, that the beacon was discovered amid ruins that predate our civilization." Respect Counselor Jayan stated, "I don't know who made it or why using it could bring something worse than the Void Swarm." She displayed the beacon, another hologram, as if it were worse than extinction. It was a plain black cylinder with marks on it that nobody could read. Despite decades of research, scientists have never ventured to transmit a signal across the galaxy. Use it to send a beacon signal to areas of the galaxy that we haven't yet visited. Jayan went on to say that although there are hazards, there may be someone who can. Help us find someone who fights in a different way than we do, someone who hasn't met the Void Swarm. Discovered how to defeat, but you're referring about the primitive sectors? One council member laughed at such planets. Some people still use fossil fuels and seldom have access to space travel. What might they do? Perhaps their raw character is just what we need to combat the Void Swarm. Jaiwan said that the swarm outperforms humans as they are able to identify our technological trends. Is completely predictable, whereas primitive species are erratic. Haven't fully optimized things and continue to experiment with odd, ineffective solutions. Examine each council member. Sometimes, Heron, defective is preferable than perfect. After examining Jivan's face for a while, she turned to face the council, and we shall. Voting is easy. We may either accept our extinction or attempt the beacon. With a swift 4-to-1 vote in favor, Jaiwan stood in historic. The black cylinder buzzed as scientists worked around her to activate the beacon in the ruins where they had discovered it. Gently, the odd marks start to glow, increasing a scientist's power levels. Signal charge that has been reported, whatever it is more potent than anything we've ever constructed. As you see the beacon's light intensifying, transmit the message, transmit everything, including our position, our predicament, and our need for assistance. The beacon pulsed once, sending a brief burst of energy into space. The scientist stated, "Now we wait," as the stars seemed to send a ripple signal. Chuan gazed. There was a vacuum swarm approaching from someplace in the night sky. She prayed that someone would hear their cry and come to our aid, whispering to the sky, "Someone please come to our aid." She was unaware that in a far-off area on a spacecraft known as the HS Horizon, a primitive species known as humanity was. Captain Yun Suk Choi was having his morning drink as they were going to get their communication, and everything was about to change. Suddenly, the HSS Horizon's bridge exploded into action as the alert went off. As he straightened in, his coffee cup clattered into its magnetic holder as crew members hurried to their posts. Science Officer Sun Mang's fingers sped over his chair report. She stopped, frowning. "We're picking up a distress signal on her screen, sir. It's like nothing I've ever seen before. Power measurements are abnormal. Display the notice on the main screen." Strange symbols flashed and altered on the bridge's display, but underneath them was a vivid depiction of a civilization being attacked, planets being annihilated, and... Can you trace it? Yun Suk had sought in a frantic cry for assistance. Was the star chart that Captain Sunmi was pointing to originating from the golden arm of the galaxy is the restricted zone, which is where the highly advanced civilizations that refuse to communicate with us pushed forward into the prohibited area. Was well known, and every human explorer was aware of the highly developed aliens that resided there and believed that humans were too archaic to care about. They possessed better weaponry, faster ships, and technology that seemed to be magic. They were now requesting assistance with the plan, therefore he naturally ordered the fastest possible pace. Although Horizon wasn't the quickest ship in the human fleet, her engines screamed to life, and it was sturdy and dependable like. The majority of human ships were designed to withstand damage and continue operating 3 days later. Reached the signal source, the location caused all of the bridge's residents to gasp. With its silver towers soaring beyond space, the lovely metropolis sailed over the sky, yet massive defense installations dangled in orbit above it, their armaments ready to frighten. It was evident that they anticipated an assault, and Sunmi reported the Commander Jaiwan Park's face appeared on the screen as she gazed at them with a. Our call was answered by someone who was both surprised and disappointed. Kept his face off screen and said, "Yum Suk," to a primitive human vessel. "I'm Captain Yun Suk Choi from the HSS Horizon, and we got your distress signal and arrived to assist, but your ship's Jaiwan was perplexed. Constructed of aluminium and powered by chemical engines, it still has manual controls. Delicious." Before Jaiwan could reply, Suk grinned. Sometimes the old methods worked best. As both ships' sirens sounded, Sunla sprang in her seat and made several calls. Shouted rapidly approaching and not matching any of the screen's recognized signatures. Jivan's face became pale when the vacuum swarm discovered us in the vicinity. Seemed to ripple, and odd ships emerged. They resembled black clouds with amorphous, changing forms as they. Energy weapons were fired at the Hanel defense sites, but the void. Swarm ships' guns are ineffective. They just changed form to evade the bullets, Sunmi said as she studied her. Yun, the swarm learned to avoid them by adapting to energy patterns. After watching the conflict for a while, he grinned and said, "Good thing we don't use Lieutenant Jinho loaded the kinetic rounds with energy weapons, and Sir Jinho smiled at the large. Opens the weapon bays of the horizon, exposing the largest rocks we have. They were manned by Hainel standards and seemed to be basic rail guns. A vacuum swarm ship was hit by the first shot from electromagnetic launchers that blasted solid metal projectiles quickly. Unexpectedly, it attempted to change shape, but physics ignored it, and the metal slug tore. The second and third blasts did the same to Jivan's eyes on the screen, sending bits hurtling into space. They can be taught to avoid energy patterns if you go wide and strike them. Yuma clarified, yet they are unable to dispute Newton's law, a rock is a rock. Vacuum swarm ships showed up, but for the first time, they looked to be avoiding the horizon. Commander Park Yumuk, who was uncertain, said, "I believe it's time we had a good chat here. We have what we'll call experience together, and individuals have the technology. We could just have a." By coincidence, Jade glanced at the wrecked vacuum swarm ships before turning back to Yunu. The crew of the Horizon applauded as the vacuum swarm, and she continued softly, "We have something to learn from your primitive ways." Withdrew. It wasn't a significant win, but it was a beginning and it demonstrated something. Importantly, often the simplest solution, even if it included hurling pretty large objects, was the best one. Lieutenant Jinho Ryu was in front of the Hainel War Council, and he was rocking pretty rapidly. The Hainel officials were perplexed as they pointed to a plain paper map that was put out on the table. They were used to holograms, and "We battle using computer screens rather than paper and markers," according to Jinho. "Sometimes the old methods are more effective than the new ones," Commander Jan observed. Great curiosity after her victory against the vacuum swarm on his horizon. Asked others to share their military expertise, and what she saw astounded and captivated her. "You mean too? Tell me." A handler told me that people still research conflicts from thousands of years ago. Jinho grinned. He pointed to the map, saying that the fundamentals of battle never change, only the instruments. Guerrilla warfare once more, attack hard, move quickly, and never be where the adversary expects you to be. Yano Kwan, your engineer, came forward after researching for the last week. Both handling and void swarm technologies. Nonetheless, the void swarm outperformed you as they constantly recognized your ship patterns. Try to be flawless by using the same strategies, the same formation, and the same weapons. The hand-anal cops whispered among themselves, "That's your weakness." Usually, being considered imperfect was an insult. However, after seeing the human battle, they began to believe differently. John informed us that later that day, they ran a Hainel spacecraft stuck in space during the first test, but now engineer Yunho had assisted them in installing vintage chemical rockets and adding basic metal plates over their energy shields. The spacecraft seemed unsightly, patched together, and exceedingly unhanky next to its gravity drives. As planned, the void swarm struck, and their black spacecraft moved across space like angry clouds. The handling ship to combat in the same manner as before, but they were mistaken. When the spacecraft fired its chemical thrusters, it spun in a manner that gravity drives shouldn't have been able to do. The ship released basic metal in order to resist the vacuum swarm's energy weapons. When the swarm attempted to move, springs only threw sharp metal fragments out of spears. Forecast their travel patterns. The ship performed an entirely arbitrary observation. Over the radio, this Jinho said that he hit a button on the metal plates. Expecting a trick, the vacuum swarm abruptly split apart, enveloping the spacecraft. Should stay clear of them, but they weren't weapons, rather, they served as a disguise for the hundreds of. With tiny pods that we refer to as mines, Jinho clarified that there was no energy signature or complicated. With just basic triggers and large explosions, computers, the pods floated into the. When the dark ships came into contact with the void swarms, the pods detonated instead of. Using plasma or energy beams, or just traditional chemical explosions, the swarm was unable to adjust to pure force in the Haenel officer's command center. Marveled at how the lone ship had just annihilated 12 vacuum swarm ships. One cop said, "I don't understand without using any advanced technology. Everything in this is incorrect, ineffective, and crass, especially Yano, the engineer. The reason it works is because the vacuum swarm picks up patterns, but how can they discover when there's no pattern, when each ship engages in combat in a unique way, when certain weapons are advanced and others are? How long would it take for Commander Jaiwan to go over to the tactical display?" Yano said that the adjustments are complicated and that we can update our whole fleet in a few days. "Do what Jane instructed, Lieutenant Jinho. I want you to instruct our." Jinho bowed slightly as a sign of respect for these guerrilla methods, but first. For the first time in months, the handling cops chuckled at what others refer to as playing dirty. We're beginning to see that occasionally the most sophisticated answer wasn't the best one. Sometimes you simply. Engineer Yunho had to be unexpected as they started to prepare their next course of action. She combined basic human mechanics with Haenel technology on further adjustments. Every weapon would be unexpected, every ship would be unique, and the Void Swarm was going to discover that perfection. Wasn't everything, and the Void Swarm was confronted with something they had never seen before somewhere in space. Before an adversary, they couldn't foresee one that didn't make sense. Pattern's an adversary that was probably intentionally flawed. The actual conflict was. Medical Officer Ji-song, ready to start, gazed at the Haenel Medical Bay in wonder, which was brimming with cutting edge. The automated systems and healing chambers were all hygienic and effective. Flawless, maybe too flawless. You mean she told the handle doctor you don't do? Surgery is no longer done by hand, of course, and the doctor responded that our machines are flawless and never make errors. Min took out her traditional medical bag. However, what happens if the machines malfunction or you encounter an issue that the devices are unaware of? The issue we had seen throughout the Haenel civilization, on which they relied, was that the doctor had no solution. Extensive use of their flawless technology in a different area of the city's historic heritage. The Hanley youngsters were being taught about Earth's past by a young Kim. As he showed them basic paper images of people fighting wars for hundreds of years, youngsters sat on the floor, their eyes wide. Years later, he clarified that every time we failed, we gained knowledge, and every time we won, we gained even more. We maintained everything in place, but one youngster wondered why we should look at the past. New isn't always better, sometimes old is better. Stay youthful and grin. The finest solutions are found in stories like David and Goliath, in which a tiny individual. The kids leaned forward, eager for more tales, after defeating a monster wearing advanced armor with a simple stone. I've never heard anything like this. Their past was all about advancement and improving and perfecting things. Meanwhile, Captain Yoon-suk and Commander Jivan were eating in the Horizon's modest dining room, which she chose. It's odd that the ideal nutrition paste she was used to wasn't there in her food, real cooked meat and veggies. She continued, "The point is that every bite has a different taste." Yum grinned. "Humans want diversity, and although we could create food as good as yours, we decide not to since life is full of flaws." Jaiwan grabbed another mouthful, thinking that your combat techniques were fascinating. "Like your tales, your medication embraces chaos in all you do. When things are too perfect, chaos is a terrible thing that can be fixed. They grow fragile and shatter one component, which causes the whole thing to collapse. But when are flexible, after that day, Mindy was able to bend rather than shatter. Many were disappointed when they were taught how to do basic surgery by handle physicians. Although their hands weren't as stable as machines, they gradually learned that hands could sense things. Remember what Mindy mentioned while leading a machine's hands couldn't adjust to unexpected. Perfect hands from a young doctor aren't always the finest. Sometimes you have to feel. Lieutenant Jinho saw handle troops rehearsing ancient techniques in the military training facility. They had always used energy weapons and powered armor in earth martial arts, but now they were learning how to fight. Jinho said, "Your body can't be hacked with their bodies to think on their feet. Because a computer cannot foresee your intuition, the Void Swarm. Battles Against Us engineer Yunho collaborated with the education of handle technicians. She sometimes advised them to do repairs without computers by using a wrench to strike a jammed engine component. The handle were gradually altered in order to give it a decent whack. Children learned to accept their flaws by playing messy games rather than precise models. Cooks attempted creating. Instead of using nutritional paste, scientists started experimenting with actual food. Commander Jivan, rather than only adhering to computer models that night, watched the sunset with Captain Yunsuk. The sky was a riot of color. "I now see that they were lovely because they weren't flawless," she remarked. "We secretly hoped that perfection would rescue us, but it instead made us weak. The empty swarm beats because they have forgotten how to adapt, change, and live." Nodded, "Perfect enemies, yum suck, perfect things that follow patterns, flawless things. Cannot adapt, but humans are proud to be the kings and queens of adaptability." Another Void Swarm assault was about to occur, but this time Juan. Grinning, her people were prepared to battle using both technology and instinct. The Void Swarm was about to discover that the human weren't flawless with both flawless weaponry and flawed surprises. The alert roared through every ship and station tactical officer Duan, and that made them stronger than before. B's eyes widened as he gazed at his screen. "This is the largest swarm of voids. We've never seen a fleet with hundreds of ships," and Captain Yumuk and Commander Jaiwan stood. The view screen displayed a horrifying scene of the United Fleet's command ship's bridge, side by side. "They're desperate," Yumuk said as the Void Swarm ships in the horizon turned dark. "They are determined to kill us, Jaiwan, since they know we are harming them." I nodded. "Keep in mind that you train to fight like a human in all ship fighting postures." Each ship in the armada facing the Void Swarm had a unique appearance. Others were coated with metal plates, others had rail guns, and some had energy weapons. Others proudly displayed their shields, but the Void Swarm's computers were unable to locate any. Thunder Duyen brought out the humans, who had dubbed the pattern to examine the initial wave assault pattern. Since the weather was natural and unpredictable, the initial set of ships' attack tactics were all based on the weather. Went forward, but instead of launching their guns, they let forth clouds of plain. Swarms of spacecraft sped through the metal dust, perhaps believing it to be innocent now, Duan yelled, and all ships fully engaged their energy shields. L voltage illuminated the metal dust, and the void swarm ships captured. Another set of ships began to split apart as the second wave pattern lightning moved in some mines that were discharged, some that fired solid projectiles, and others that launched energy beams. Because every ship fought differently, the void swarm was unable to adjust to all of the assaults on a ship at once. Engineerio cleaned her most recent creation, which consisted of basic revolving mirrors. Aboard some ships, the energy assaults of the void swarm appeared in the mirrors. The swarm couldn't anticipate where its own projectiles would go, so they bounced them back at random. J1 ordered, "Keep them from learning our tactics since the conflict included large, disorganized Hanel ships." Human spacecraft plunged directly into battles, firing as they swirled and rolled in ways that seemed incorrect yet were flawless. The void swarm started using high-tech weaponry in addition to conventional bullets and missiles. To display symptoms of bewilderment, their spacecraft sometimes bumped and traveled less smoothly into one another while attempting to adjust to too many situations simultaneously. Duan said they're having trouble responding and that their response time is slowing down. After processing all the various dangers, the biggest surprise from behind arrived. The massive cargo ships in the fleet arrived, opened their doors, and emptied their simple space rock freight weighing millions of tons, the void swarm sensors ignored the innocuous pebbles in favor of the fleet's weaponry, which was a mistake. There was nothing to adjust to. Gravity was all that was there as the rocks smashed through their formation, shattering ships en masse, carrying on with their billion-year-old pattern. Storm G1 directed all ships to launch a simultaneous strike using whichever weapons they choose. Some of the combined fleet-charged energy beams came into contact with actual bullets. Ships used reinforced hulls to run the adversary, while others set traps using basic net-like devices that tangled the vacuum. Swarm ships, the flawless structures of the vacuum swarm, disintegrated for the first time. Duan exclaimed with excitement as they began to flee in chaos, their ships emitting distress signals. The bridge crew applauded as the void swarm called for assistance. They had succeeded, and later on, the largest vacuum swarm fleet had ever seen fled. "I never imagined that I would see Captain Yun-suk in the observation room as they tallied their triumphs. She said that humans learn to be flawed, which is why the void swarm is fleeing." Suk smiled. "Not flawed, and as adaptive as nature itself, the void swarm is capable of learning patterns, but as nature lacks them, they are unable to defeat it." Whether J1 nodded over the fleet crews like pebbles in space or like people, hailed the fact that humanity in Hanel had defeated an adversary that had appeared unbeatable, not with flawless technology, but with the ideal balance of traditional with new planned, high-tech, random, and low-tech. The void swarm had discovered an vital lesson. Sometimes the opponent you can't expect is the most deadly. The conflict wasn't done, but now everything had changed. Humans and their new handle buddies were the most unpredictable. The void swarm came to fear Commander Hyan today, marking a shift. Prior to the human and handle ship fleet being merged, each ship had dents, patches, and other markings from prior engagements. The handle would have referred to these ships as ugly months ago after repairs, but now they saw the splendor in their battle scars, and were stopping our jogging today. It was stated over the "Today, we hunted the vacuum swarm on Fleet Channel, which was enormous, with hundreds of. Each ship was unique. Some had a pure handle design, while others were. The majority of humans were a blend of odd but useful mixes of sophisticated. We discovered that technology in Commander Jan's voice from simple solutions. Today, we conclude this. Their home system is where they rebuild their fleets. The fleet entered the conflict more quickly than light travel, and human ships exploited there. Simple but dependable leap drives handle ships used their more sophisticated systems. The Void Swarm was unable to forecast where they would all arrive since they traveled in tiny groups along various routes. Engineer Yunho, who had collaborated with both, performed last-minute inspections on their newest weaponry. She reminded the weapons crews that they needed to be made by human and handly engineers. The fleet slipped out of light speed near an odd star, so swapped between weapon kinds at random to prevent them from adapting. System: a cloud of black ships almost obscured the sun in the center of the. According to Tactical Officer Duan, the Void Swarm never anticipated our discovery of them. They never believed that we would have the courage to assault the Void Swarm, but they responded swiftly. Their ships creating flawless patterns, whereas the human-handled fleet failed to create any patterns at all. Thunder freed the nets High and commanded, and the gang decided to fight in its own manner. The Void Swarm disregarded the massive nets composed of crude metal tools that were dispersed over space because they were too archaic to be dangerous, but concealed electric charges were triggered when the nets came into contact with their ships. The group lightning strike was trapped by the nets that encircled the swarm ships. Pattern Rain, a second fleet of ships arrived, their energy weaponry swapped out for basic pressurized tanks of. When water in space froze, it immediately turned into ice crystal clouds. Attached to the ships of the Void Swarm, preventing them from changing form. The Void Swarm attempted to adapt, but every human handle group used a variety of strategies, with some ships launching conventional nuclear. Some used the most sophisticated energy beams, while others utilized basic but effective weaponry. They are attempting to flee after throwing large rocks quickly, according to the Deed Gun report. Despite the fact that their patterns are unraveling, Hein grinned and refused to let go of the. When Yunho, the special weapon engineer, clicked a button, hundreds of small pods exploded. Every pod in the fleet had a basic radio transmitter that sent out random signals across all frequencies. The communication network of the Void Swarm was abruptly overloaded with ship's noise. Yeno clarified that they are unable to communicate with one another and exchange information on what. Each ship must determine what works and what doesn't on its own without their. When the Void Swarm ships started to malfunction, some of them attempted to restrict energy using shared intelligence. Firearms, but were physically attacked, while some reshaped themselves to avoid shots, but immediately launched into energy beams, pushing ahead with a cleanliness command to avoid giving them. Considering that the human handlers of the fleet charged have received training for this. Practiced combat amid the turmoil of the Void Swarm, otherwise, they could only engage in combat. Perfect was no longer sufficient, and the conflict raged hour after hour. Their house came apart when the numbers of the Void Swarms plummeted from their ideal forms. System that had seemed to be so robust was turning into their trap, so at last, Hin gave the. As of the last instruction, the whole fleet assaulted the Star Shield. Fired anything, including rocks, frozen water, bullets, rockets, and energy rays. Even basic explosives and electromagnetic pulses may conceal the star in a cloud. split apart as sunlight hit the surface for the first time in maybe thousands of years. DN said, really running their ships are, as the vacuum swarms home. The crews rejoiced as they leaped out in various directions, destroying the main fleet of the Void Swarm. Since their house was exposed, it would take years or maybe decades to reconstruct if they could. Hayne and Jan subsequently meet aboard the command ship? We did, she answered plainly. We learned to be unexpected because of it, so Jaiwan nodded. No, Hayne grinned as we both learned from each other that perfection isn't always correct. Other people and deal with it collectively, which is what made us powerful. The conflict wasn't. Swarm ships had fled from the whole emptiness, but their primary force was. Two civilizations had discovered that their ideal system had been shattered. The best thing about being unique, erratic, and flawed was that strength of all 1 year after the major conflict, the capital city of Hainel appeared. Children now have gardens blooming on the once perfect silver towers, performed in less than square parks, and in the main square anew. A basic stone figure of a human hand with a handle hand clasp positioned in the middle of the memorial. Captain Yunsuk and Commander Jaiwan stood together to watch ships dock at. Some of the spaceport's vehicles had sleek handles, while others were robust human chips. Remember when we first met, Jivan? There were a lot of new designs that combined the two styles. I inquired, thinking you were too archaic to assist us. You chuckled, and now look. Not awful at all, yet some of your ships are much more repulsive than ours. Rectified combat tested as if it appeared like that ancient Earth phrase you taught me. Stupid but effective, they stroll across the city together in unison. While Yano, the area engineer, was instructing a class of young handle and human pupils, learning to combine advanced technologies with basic mechanics side by side today. As we study backup systems, Yenho informed her students that sometimes the finest. In the military school, a computer's backup is a simple lever, Lieutenant. Jinho saw human and Halo troops training together. Some used energy weapons, while others used basic. They all discovered that projectile weapons are unpredictable, and the Void Swarm is still. Jinho reminded them out there, but we now know how to combat them, not flawlessly. Patterns, but I worked as a medical officer at the hospital with perfect chaos. Physicians discovered both automated and manual controls for their healing pods using handle physicians. After surgery on their hands, they were prepared for anything. Balanced many often advised using the never rely too much on either at the scientific center. When machines are at their finest, use your hands. Tai Young, the cultural attaché, met with Hainel historians and they were documenting the narrative of the conflict, not just the triumphs, but also the errors that failures and the lessons learned future generations must understand at an early age. Said that sometimes you need to explore the wildest ideas since perfection isn't always the greatest. It had been a year after the defeat of the Void Swarm when a huge celebration got underway. The city was illuminated by some electric lights and some fire music. Using both conventional instruments and sophisticated synthesizers, Commander Hin. Not because we were stronger or more, she replied, raising a glass to victory. Sophisticated, but because we are taught to be unique, surprising, and the audience applauded us, and Hainel and I celebrated by eating both. Yin delivered Yin some sloppy, tasty meal that was cooked in great vitamin cubes. The defense fleet reported that the few Void Swarm ships that remained kept far away, having learned their lesson. Late that night, G1 and the others were unable to defeat an opponent they could not have predicted. Yuma gazed at the sky while standing on a balcony, with a little black cylinder resting on the ancient beacon that began it all was placed on the table between them, but its maker is still unknown, according to Jaiwan. For us to discover, maybe they were aware that occasionally delicious suck. The people who seem archaic are just what you need, maybe Jaiwan grinned, or perhaps they just understood that the most powerful force in the world isn't flawless technology, but rather the capacity to adjust to shift to collaborate underneath them. The party went on, and human children experimented with new human-style machines while playing with handled toys. Once believing they had nothing in common, civilizations realized they had all learned a lesson from the Void Swarm. Perfect isn't always correct, and sometimes the finest isn't always advanced. Unpredictability is your greatest quality. Sometimes the easiest option is the best one, and occasionally, the people who respond to your frantic cry for assistance in space may not be what you anticipated. Despite their imperfections, primitive people might be just what you need in a transformed civilization that the Hanel will never be was illuminated by the stars above. Likewise, they had discovered how to cherish flaws, accept turmoil, and draw power from change. And it all began when they requested assistance, and only humans showed their